Now is the time to commit to end extreme poverty. We're in an auspicious moment in history when the successes of past decades and an increasingly favorable economic outlook combine to give developing countries a chance, for the first time ever, to end extreme poverty within a generation.
Welcome back. That was World Bank President Dr. Jim Yong Kim addressing a crowd in Washington, D.C. Are we close to ending extreme poverty or just making poverty worse? Joining us now is Jessica Evans. She's a senior advocate and researcher for World Financial Institutions with Human Rights Watch. And with us from Tucson, Arizona is Ted Downing, the founder of International Network of Displacement and Resettlement. And he has more than 40 years of research into the effects of displacement on communities. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Ted, looking at this report produced by the International Consortium of Journalists and what they found about the displacement of people, you were an advisor to the World Bank. You brought many of these human rights violations to their attention initially. What did you find about how the bank responded?
I think that the bank responded reluctantly, and I think it should be pointed out that that report, those 3 reports that were released on the 4th of March, were released reluctantly and at the last minute. The bank has a problem. For 20 years, we haven't been able to look closely at what was happening, to how many people were displaced, what was happening to them, except through complaints to the inspection panel, which is kind of like the internal investigation group. Now we know that the bank actually has very little knowledge of what's happening to people that are in its way, and those of us that are the specialists in this area, we know from scientific work and the bank's own work that people that are facing forced displacement by infrastructure projects face the risk of extreme poverty, exactly what the bank is trying to alleviate.
Right, Jessica, we looked at this report, and some of it's pretty devastating when we look at the people who've been displaced, some of the abuses that they've been subjected to. You've been monitoring this for Human Rights Watch. What did you make of it?
The report reflected a number of the cases that Human Rights Watch has been documenting. For instance, in Ethiopia, Human Rights Watch has found that the government's program of villagization, as they call it, whereby they move indigenous peoples and other marginalized peoples from their own lands into new villages with the idea of providing them there with better basic services, has been ripe with extreme violence. This has resulted in a number of people actually leaving their land and leaving the new places that the government is building with some World Bank support and seeking refuge abroad. So in this particular case, we found really serious, violent human rights abuses.
Right, what about the numbers in the report? I mean, 3.5 million people displaced over a 10-year period. You know, we just talked to Paul Cadario, who's a former official of the World Bank in the first segment of the program. He disputes that. He said, look, what is in the report warrants our attention. It is extremely serious stuff, but there's an extrapolation of numbers there which is really unsubstantiated.
One of our biggest concerns is that the World Bank cannot tell us the numbers of those that have been resettled. And while I haven't checked on ICAJ's numbers and how they were actually formulated, and I realize the World Bank's that they've been disputing those numbers, really the bigger question is, how can the World Bank not be monitoring this closely enough to know exactly how many people are affected? The World Bank has now responded with an action plan which has some positive elements, promising to train their staff better, to invest better in resettlement. But one crucial missing part of this is actually going back and finding out what has happened to the people that the World Bank that has resettled or that have been resettled because of World Bank finance projects, and how are we going to make things right?
Okay, Ted, here is the process as I understand it. The World Bank formulates a plan for a developing country. That country accepts that plan, then the plan is implemented, and it is left to the national government.
Somewhat happens.
Yeah,
I think it somewhat happens. Let's first, when people are resettled, and let's look at what happens. The scientists have found, including World Bank scientists, that when you initiate a resettlement, you're taking people, you're building an infrastructure project, you're removing people from their place, from their livelihoods, you're taking away their land, you're taking away their jobs, you're creating risk of food insecurity, and you're also creating human rights risk. All those things we call the resettlement effect. That resettlement effect has to be countered. If you don't, what will happen is the people will definitely be impoverished. And by impoverished, I mean they'll be impoverished at a greater level of poverty than they were before. So in our studies, we'll find levels of landliness in a population, say, of 70% that don't have land, and it can increase to 90, or it can go from 50 to 20. We've got lots of information in our studies. The problem the bank had is that its purpose, it's a development bank, and development that impoverishes is not development, and that's the contradiction. It's creating poverty, and part of the issue for the bank is how do they avoid creating new poverty on top of the poverty that they're trying to alleviate. So it's a contradiction, it's part of the project itself, and it can be avoided, it can be mitigated if it's done properly. And what we see is a failure to even recognize, as Jessica was saying, failure to even recognize that resettlement is taking place. In over 60% of the projects that the bank itself surveyed, they found that they had no idea how many people were displaced or what happened to their livelihood. I don't know how Paul or anybody who was in management at that time could be making claims that the numbers are lower or higher or whatever, because the truth is they're up to their eyeballs in ignorance.
And the resettlement itself is done by national governments. What kind of monitoring is there by the World Bank?
Well, there's a change going on. Under the current policy, which is very clear, it recognizes what I call the resettlement risk, and it demands their mitigation, and it also demands the current policy that people who are resettled are beneficiaries of the project, direct beneficiaries, and that the project be designed as a resettlement project. Under the new proposed system that Dr. Kim has put into place, my fellow anthropologist, the obligation will only be compensation for land. Who supervises? Your question. And currently, you can go to the inspection panel and make a complaint if you're being resettled if the management itself, the bank management, fails to follow the policies. Under the new scheme, the management is no longer responsible. Now responsibility falls on the borrowing country. And we know from the beginning that the borrowing countries are exceedingly weak. Many of them are following old colonial laws of eminent domain, that the only responsibility that a government has to its people is to pay for the land. And in many of these cases, these are the weakest, most poorly defined situations, many of them indigenous peoples or minorities who don't even have clear land title. So basically, the concept is that the state has to pay you for your land. That does not counter the resettlement effect, and again, development that impoverishes is not development, and that's the contradiction that Dr. Kim faces.
Right. Jessica, the bank itself has built-in safeguards
Yes.
against what is happening right now. What happened to those safeguards?
In a number of cases.
Go ahead.
In a number of cases, the safeguards are not properly implemented. There isn't in place the necessary supervision by the bank to ensure that those safeguards are complied with. In other cases, the safeguards themselves fall short. One big gap is the lack of recognition of the human rights impacts of World Bank projects. What Human Rights Watch has been really pushing the bank to do is to recognise that in a whole number of projects, there are significant human rights risks, and we need to actively look to identify those risks and to mitigate them, both at the very beginning when a project is being designed and then throughout implementation. But the World Bank has resisted this analysis of human rights, unfortunately deeming it political or too political for the bank, rather than recognising that the bank has a key obligation to ensure that it is not violating human rights or it's not financing human rights violations.
Ted, what is your experience of the bank meeting those obligations, the human rights obligations?
Well, the obligations have been, first is the bank has a responsibility, as Jessica, I think, is pointing out, to at least monitor the human rights. Even if you don't react to them, can you at least tell us? We know that human rights violations are part and parcel of what's called the resettlement effect that always accompanies, the resettlement effect not necessarily happens, but always accompanies the risk of a resettlement. So the concept that human rights violations that are unseen are insignificant, which I think is the position taken by the bank right now. If they would at least go so far as to say they will monitor human rights violations, I would be extremely pleased. as president of the International Association of Professionals to at least see the monitoring take place. Whether they react to that, they can go another level, but at least find out. The most clear violation of human rights is one of the unequal power. As I said, many of the people that are displaced are powerless. They have weak land tenure. Nobody displaces peoples in the best parts of Manhattan. It's too risky. And the one thing that's missing is legal representation. The bank finances the borrower. The borrower's legal studies of its takings or its removal of people's rights. It does not finance or provide financial assistance to the people who are being displaced in their legal representation. Many of them have no representation whatsoever, and you're putting them up against a gargantuan task of fighting a bank which has 400 or 500 lawyers. The borrower has money, and you're asking these poor people who are almost to the point of poverty right now to stand up against the bank. That, right from the beginning, creates a situation.
Jessica, very quickly, is anything going to change? We know that the US Congress has actually taken one step. They've approved a measure which actually tells the representative to the World Bank not to approve any projects where there are weaker safeguards. Is anything changing?
That's the big question. Our push is for the new safeguards to really integrate human rights due diligence into them. But at the moment, I have to say it doesn't look good. President Jim Kim really needs to take a leadership role here and to publicly commit to ensure that the bank will not finance any human rights violations and then integrate those into the new policies.
That's right.